As tensions rise, he ignores the driver's calm explanations, determined to make an arrest. But when the driver finally reveals his identity, Richard's world is turned upside down. What happens next will leave you speechless as the power dynamic shifts in an unexpected and life-changing way for both men. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, share, and spread the love. Today's story is one you won't want to miss. It was a windy evening in the quiet, small town of Brookville. The streets were nearly empty, and the orange glow of the streetlights flickered in the cool breeze. Officer Richard, a white police officer who had spent years patrolling these roads, was cruising down the highway in his patrol car. His mind wandered as he drove, keeping a casual eye on the passing vehicles. Richard had a reputation that followed him like a shadow. He was known for pulling over black drivers, especially if they drove expensive cars, assuming the worst without any real cause. As he drove, a sleek black car sped past him on the highway. Richard's eyes narrowed. Without bothering to check the car's registration or the driver's details, his hand instinctively went to his lights, flicking them on. "Another one," he muttered under his breath. He quickly pulled onto the road, tailing the car as it slowed down and pulled over to the side. As Richard approached the car, the wind tugged at his uniform, and a cloud of dust rose from the roadside. His eyes were sharp, filled with suspicion. In his mind, he had already decided who the driver was. A troublemaker, someone who didn't belong in a car that nice. He didn't need to check anything to know what he thought was true. The window of the car rolled down slowly, and Richard's hand hovered near his belt, ready to pull out his ticket book or worse, depending on how the driver reacted. But when he saw who was sitting in the driver's seat, his eyes hardened even more. Inside the car sat Officer Lucas, a black man in his early 40s, casually dressed in jeans and a simple shirt. What Richard didn't know or bother to check was that Lucas was not just any man. He was a high-ranking police captain from a nearby city, and he had been driving home after visiting family. Lucas, with a calm expression, glanced up at Richard, clearly surprised by the sudden stop, but composed nonetheless. "Step out of the car," Richard said, his tone cold and commanding. He didn't ask for a license or registration. He didn't care to know who Lucas was. Lucas raised an eyebrow, puzzled by the aggressive demand but still calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. "I said step out of the car," Richard repeated, his voice sharp and full of authority. He wasn't in the mood for questions, and the tone in his voice left no room for argument. Lucas nodded, trying to de-escalate the situation before it got worse. He had been in situations like this before. He knew exactly how quickly things could spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow and deliberate. Richard eyed Lucas with suspicion, his mind racing with assumptions. Nice car, casually dressed. He must be hiding something. Lucas, still calm, stood by his car, his eyes meeting Richard's. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Lucas asked, trying again to keep things civil. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it, the kind that came from years of experience. He was used to handling difficult situations, but this felt different. There was an intensity in Richard's stance, a hostility that Lucas couldn't ignore. "You were speeding," Richard snapped, though Lucas knew that wasn't the real reason. There was something else in the officer's eyes, something Lucas had seen before. Richard took a step closer, his hand still resting on his belt. "You got anything illegal in the car? Drugs? Weapons?" Lucas frowned slightly. "No, officer. I'm a police captain, actually. But Richard wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind, and nothing Lucas said was going to change it. To Richard, this was just another black man with an expensive car. The badge didn't matter. The rank didn't matter. His bias had already clouded his judgment. "Hands on the car," Richard barked, his voice growing harsher. "Now." Lucas, though surprised by the escalation, remained calm. He had to. He knew that any sign of resistance could make things worse. Slowly, he placed his hands on the hood of his car, his mind racing. This is going too far. Richard, growing more agitated, reached for his handcuffs. The metal clinked as he pulled them from his belt. "You're under arrest," he said, though he hadn't given any real reason. Lucas, feeling the tension rising, took a deep breath. He knew he had to tread carefully. "Officer, if you'd just check my ID, you'll see." "Quiet." Richard interrupted, snapping the cuffs open. He was ready to make the arrest, not realizing who he was about to cuff. Lucas kept his voice steady, though the danger in the moment was clear. "I'm telling you, officer, I'm a captain. This is all a mistake." But Richard wasn't listening. His hand moved toward Lucas, ready to force the cuffs on him, but Lucas remained composed, determined not to let this moment get out of hand. The tension was thick in the air, the wind whipping around them as Richard, blinded by his assumptions, prepared to arrest the very man who could change his life forever. Richard's frustration grew with every second. As he stood next to Lucas, towering over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A black man, driving a car like this. There's no way he's telling the truth, Richard thought to himself, the bias clouding his judgment. The idea of Lucas being a police captain seemed laughable to him, and the more Lucas tried to explain, the angrier Richard became. "Police captain? You expect me to believe that?" Richard spat, his tone full of disbelief. "You don't look like any captain I've ever seen." His eyes flicked back to the car, lingering on the expensive leather interior. "How's a guy like you afford a car like this anyway?" Lucas, keeping his voice calm and measured, said, "Officer, if you just check my badge, you'll see I'm telling the truth. I've been with the force for over 15 years. This is all a misunderstanding." But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was too consumed by his assumptions. "Misunderstanding, huh?" He sneered, stepping closer to Lucas, the tension crackling in the air. "You think you can just throw a title at me and I'll let you go? I'm not stupid. You don't belong in a car like this unless you're hiding something. You got drugs, guns." Lucas frowned, feeling the conversation spiraling out of control. He'd been in tight situations before, but there was something dangerous about this one. Richard's tone was more than just suspicion. It was anger, laced with racial bias, and that made the situation all the more volatile. "I'm not hiding anything," Lucas said, still trying to remain calm. "I'm a police captain. You can check my badge number. It's—" "Shut up," Richard barked, his face now inches from Lucas. "You think I'm an idiot? You're lying. I can see it all over your face." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that nothing he said would break through Richard's bias. Richard wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in proving his own twisted assumptions. But Lucas couldn't afford to escalate things. He knew what could happen if he lost his composure. "Let me see your ID," Richard snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And don't pull anything stupid." Lucas slowly reached into his pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements. He pulled out his wallet, handed Richard his badge and ID, and watched as Richard barely glanced at them before tossing them aside. "Fake badge," Richard muttered, his voice now seething with anger. "You think I haven't seen this kind of trick before? You're going to tell me a black man in jeans and a t-shirt is a captain?" He scoffed. "Don't waste my time." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Please, check my badge number. Call it in. This can all be cleared up." But Richard wasn't hearing any of it. His hand gripped his radio tightly as he called for backup, his eyes never leaving Lucas. "I got a suspect here," Richard said into his radio, his voice low and tense. "Claims he's some police captain, but I need backup to search the car. He's probably armed." Lucas's heart sank. He knew what backup meant. It would be a disaster. Once more officers arrived, The situation could spiral out of control, and he could be seen as a threat. Lucas tried to stay calm, but fear was starting to creep into his chest. He didn't want to be seen as the aggressor, but he also couldn't let things escalate further. Richard's aggression was rising by the second, his eyes flashing with a mixture of rage and smug satisfaction. "Get out of the car," Richard shouted, reaching for Lucas's arm. "I'm going to search this car from top to bottom, and I'm going to find out exactly what you're hiding." Lucas resisted the urge to pull away, knowing that any sudden movement could make things worse. But his patience was wearing thin. He needed to end this before it became something far worse than a misunderstanding. "Officer," Lucas said, his voice firmer now, "you're making a mistake." Richard's grip on Lucas's arm tightened, and he yanked him toward the hood of the car. "You don't tell me what I'm doing," he snarled. "I'll decide who's making the mistake." Just as things seemed to be spiraling out of control, Lucas, still calm but now desperate, turned to face Richard, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Check my badge number. Right now." Richard froze for a moment, the certainty in Lucas's voice catching him off guard. There was something different in Lucas's tone this time, something that made Richard pause. But even with that moment of hesitation, his hand remained tight around Lucas's arm, and the air between them was still heavy with danger. For the first time, Richard hesitated. There was something about the way Lucas had said those words, something firm and commanding that made him pause. His hand was still gripping Lucas's arm, but the confidence in Lucas's voice made him loosen his grip slightly. There was no panic in Lucas's voice, no pleading, just pure authority. Lucas, sensing that he needed to act quickly, moved with calm precision. He slowly reached into his pocket, his hands visible the entire time, to avoid any misunderstanding. He pulled out his police ID and held it out for Richard to see. "I'm going to show you my badge again," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Look at it closely." Richard snatched the badge from Lucas, still convinced this was some kind of trick. He stared down at the ID, his eyes scanning it quickly. His mind raced, trying to figure out what Lucas's game was. A police captain. Yeah, right, Richard thought. But then, something changed. The more Richard stared at the badge, the more his certainty began to crack. His eyes went wide as he finally registered the name on the ID. Captain Lucas Anderson, commanding officer of District 12. It wasn't just any badge. Lucas was his new commanding officer. The man standing before him was the captain assigned to oversee his entire department. Richard's heart dropped into his stomach like a lead weight. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. His world tilted on its axis, and his face turned pale. His hand trembled as he handed the badge back to Lucas, his mind spinning with the realization of what he had just done. He had almost arrested his own captain. The man he had spent the last 10 minutes interrogating, belittling, and threatening was the very person who could end his career with a single phone call. Lucas met Richard's wide-eyed gaze with calm, unwavering authority. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to get angry. His eyes alone held all the power. "You just tried to arrest your own captain," Lucas said quietly, the weight of his words sinking into Richard like a punch to the gut. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. His chest felt tight as panic flooded his system. He took a step back, stumbling slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaking. I thought you were lying. I didn't. But Richard's excuses fell flat. He knew that there was no explaining this away. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And now everything was crumbling around him. His years of unchecked behavior, the biased assumptions he had acted on time and time again, were catching up to him in one explosive moment. The suspense tightened as Richard realized he could lose everything. His job, his reputation, his freedom. He could already see it happening. The internal investigation, the media coverage, the shame that would follow him for the rest of his life. And Lucas had every right to make that happen. Richard had disrespected him, humiliated him, treated him like a criminal without cause. One call, one report, and Richard's career would be over. Desperation clawed at Richard's chest. "Please," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know." Lucas studied Richard for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Richard's heart raced as he waited for Lucas to make the call that would end everything. But then, something unexpected happened. Lucas didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he paused. He could see the fear in Richard's eyes, the panic etched into his face. "I'm giving you a choice," Lucas said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "You can turn your life around, or you can stay on this path and destroy yourself." Richard blinked, not understanding at first. What do you mean?" Lucas's gaze was piercing. "I could report you right now, Richard. I have every right to, but I'm not going to. Not yet. You need to think long and hard about what kind of person you want to be. You can't keep living this way. The way you acted tonight. It's going to ruin you. You'll destroy yourself if you don't change." Richard stood there, his mind reeling from the weight of Lucas's words. He had expected punishment, but instead, Lucas was offering him something else. A chance to change. A chance to turn his life around before it was too late. "I'll be watching," Lucas said, his eyes locked onto Richard's. "What happens next is up to you." Richard stood frozen, his mind spinning as Lucas's words echoed in his head. His hands trembled. The same hands that moments ago were ready to cuff an innocent man. But now, the reality of what he had done and who he had become was crashing down around him. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about the years of unchecked anger, prejudice, and hate that had shaped his every decision, staring him in the face through Lucas's calm yet powerful presence. He couldn't deny it anymore. His assumptions, his biases, they were all wrong. Richard felt his chest tighten with the weight of his actions. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that he knew who Lucas was without ever really seeing him. And now, standing here, exposed and vulnerable, he could see himself for what he had become. A man driven by fear and hate, blinded by his own ignorance. Lucas's voice was steady, but there was no malice in it. "I should report you, Richard," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "But I believe in second chances. I believe people can change if they want to." The words hit Richard like a cold splash of water. Lucas could have destroyed him right there. He had every right to. But instead, he was offering him something Richard hadn't expected. Mercy. A chance to change. It was something Richard didn't deserve, but it was right in front of him. Richard's breath came in shallow gasps. He could feel the shame rising up inside him, choking him. He had been wrong, so very wrong. And now he was being forced to confront that ugly truth. His entire life, his job, his reputation, his very identity, was on the line. He knew Lucas could take it all away with a single report. And yet, Lucas wasn't doing that. Lucas took one last long look at Richard, his eyes calm but full of meaning. "I'll be watching you," he said quietly, before turning and walking back to his car. Richard stood by the roadside, watching as Lucas's car pulled away, the taillights disappearing into the night. He felt overwhelmed, his body shaking with fear and shame. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he realized that Lucas had given him a gift, an opportunity to change the course of his life. But the decision was his alone. As the silence of the night settled around him, Richard looked down at his hands, hands that had once been so ready to act out of hate. He felt the shame of all those years flood through him. He had the power to ruin his own life, or he had the chance to become something better. For the first time in a long time, Richard knew that his next move was the most important one of his life. Would he continue down the path of destruction, or would he take this second chance and turn his life around? The choice was his. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more captivating tales. Let us know where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like and share the video. Until next time, take care.